In 1900, New Zealand officially declared gorse a noxious weed. This thorny shrub grows taller than a man, chokes the grass on pastures, and catches fire easily in dry weather. For almost 90 years, people burned it, poisoned it, and ripped it out with bulldozers. And for all 90 years, it won. Then in September 1987, a botanist named Hugh Wilson took charge of 269 acres of farmland, completely overrun by this weed, and told his neighbors he would not touch it, he would not poison it, he would not burn it, he would not dig it out, he would let the gorse grow. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from a neighboring farmer. He called Wilson a fool and a dreamer, and promised that within 10 years, he would destroy this land and ruin every farm in the district. 39 years have passed. Where that farm once stood, there is now a thick forest. It has more than 50 waterfalls and dozens of bird species that had not been seen here in years. And the gorse has almost vanished. It killed itself. And the strangest part is this. The botanist who did all of it never planted a single tree. The land Wilson took over was ruined. The previous farmer had done everything the experts advised. He sprayed the weed with poison, he burned it, he tore it out with a bulldozer, and every time, the shrub came back even thicker than before. By the day the farm was sold, the gorse had taken it over completely, and it did not reach the country by accident. People brought gorse in themselves and planted it as a cheap living fence. The thorny bushes kept livestock from wandering off, and they cost less than any fence you could build. Back in 1835, a young Charles Darwin saw such hedges here. People planted the very thing they would go on to fight for 90 years. The land was bought by Maurice White, an accountant who had spent years setting money aside for one dream: to buy a piece of land and bring back the birds he had heard as a boy and barely heard anymore. He knew nothing about botany, but he had the money for the land, and he could hire someone who did know. And Hugh Wilson was the perfect man. He was not a dreamer with a nice theory. Before this, he had spent 5 years studying the entire peninsula alone. He divided it into equal squares and walked 1,331 sample plots. And to reach some of them, he had to be lowered down sheer cliffs on a rope. He knew that coast better than anyone alive, and he knew what it had been before: solid forest, from the mountaintop all the way down to the sea. By the start of the 20th century, almost none of that forest was left. First, it was cut down and sold. The trees went into houses and ships. Then what remained was burned and plowed under for sheep pasture. In less than 50 years, the peninsula lost nearly all of its forest. During those 5 years, the botanist noticed something no farmer ever had. Everyone looked at the gorse from above and saw only a yellow wall of thorns. But Wilson pushed his way inside it and looked down at his feet. And there, in the shade of the thorns, young native seedlings were growing. Nobody had planted them. Trees that could not survive on open pasture were growing just fine inside a wall of weeds. He had to work out why. And that same answer held the key to something else. Why the farmers had been losing for 90 years straight. It all comes down to gorse seeds, which lie in the ground alive for decades. A single seed can wait in the soil longer than the whole working life of the farmer fighting it. It simply lies there and waits for its moment. And what wakes it up is anything that disturbs the earth. The heat of a fire cracks the seed's hard shell, and a bulldozer or a plow turns the sleeping seeds up to the surface, into the light. That was the trap. When a farmer burned the thickets or broke open the ground with a bulldozer, he thought he was destroying the weed. In fact, he was giving a signal to millions of sleeping seeds. The ground is clear, come up. So, 90 years of war against the weed turned into 90 years of sowing it. The farmers were seeding their own fields with fresh gorse by their own hands. People kept waking up the very enemy they were trying to kill. Eventually, they even set insects on the gorse. 7 different kinds, beetles, mites, moths, were brought in from abroad to eat its seeds and its shoots. Each of them did some damage, but not one of them could finish it off. And yet the gorse does have one weakness. In deep shade, its seeds will not sprout. Light is the one thing it cannot live without. which means that to defeat seeds that wait 40 years in the ground, you cannot burn the land, or dig it, or poison it. You have to cover it in shade. And there was only one shrub in the whole district that could cast a shadow like that: the gorse itself. Here is where it gets interesting. Gorse is a relative of clover and peas. Like them, it makes the soil richer. Bacteria live on its roots that pull nitrogen straight out of the air and feed it into the earth. And so, soil stripped bare by livestock becomes fit for plants again. At the same time, the thorny growth stands like a solid wall, and no sheep or cow can push through it. And it casts a deep shade, so the gorse feeds the soil, guards it from livestock, and shelters it from the sun. Without ever knowing it, the weed prepares the perfect place for a future forest. And then come the birds. Inside the thorns, they feel safe. No large predator can get to them there. Birds fly into those branches from the surviving patches of old forest, and in their droppings they carry the seeds of forest trees. The seeds fall through the thorns straight into that rich soil. And so, the gorse grows the very thing that will kill it. For the first few years, the weed shoots up fast. Then, after about 10 years, its branches start to break under their own weight. The thickets thin out, light comes down through them, and down below, the young trees are already waiting. They grew up in the gorse's shade, under its protection, and now they reach for the light, rise above the gorse, and cut off its sun. And the gorse, which cannot live without bright sunlight, dies in the shade of the very trees it raised. It falls to the ground and rots into the soil, feeding it one last time. The weed they had tried to destroy for 90 years with fire and poison turned out to be the shortest road back to a forest. Scientists call plants like this nurse plants. Just as a nurse raises a child that is not her own, the gorse raised a forest that was not its own. It sheltered it, fed it, waited until it could stand on its own feet, and then gave up its place to it. Wilson wrote all of this up and published it in a scientific journal. His neighbors did not believe him. They believed what they saw with their own eyes: yellow thickets behind a fence creeping closer every year. By law, Wilson was required to clear the gorse along the boundary of his property. He cleared exactly one narrow strip beside the fence, and not an inch more. Every year, the inspectors came, and every year, the neighbors grew more certain they had been right. The land behind that fence was turning yellower. One of them remembered coming to Wilson's open day as a boy and seeing nothing but yellow thickets all the way to the horizon. And their fear was not empty. Every farmer in the district knew that the wind carries gorse seed a long way, and that sooner or later it would land on his fields. As they saw it, the man behind that fence was growing a plague that would destroy their farms. That is where the letter about the fool and the dreamer came from. Then came a drought, one of the worst in years. The neighbors' livestock began to starve. The grass on the pastures burned away to nothing. But on Wilson's land there was still grass. No livestock had trampled his ground, and the thorny growth gave shade, so the soil did not dry out as fast. And so Wilson, the very man who was supposedly ruining the whole district, opened his gates and let his neighbor's starving animals graze on his land. The neighbor he helped became a friend for life, and for many years, the only one. After that, nothing changed. The gorse stood there, just as yellow as ever. The neighbors kept laughing. 3 years after the drought, Maurice White raised the money again and bought the neighboring farm. The same accountant who had spent years saving for his dream was now putting into it everything he had. The property grew almost tenfold. Wilson was now responsible for more than 2,500 acres of land, steep slopes and remote gorges that are nearly impossible to reach. He had no car then and has none now, so every 10 days he rode 56 miles on his bicycle, there and back, to get to his land. Later, he simply moved onto it, into a small house that ran on solar panels. And all that time, he went on doing work that nobody around him understood. A year passed after his decision, then 3, then 5, then nearly 10. By the mid-90s, it looked as though the neighbor's letter had been right after all. And then the land began to change. In 1997, on the oldest part of the property, the gorse started to collapse. Not everywhere, but in patches, in the places where young trees had come up first, and a real forest was rising through it. That same neighbor, the one Wilson had helped in the drought, admitted later that he had been sure it would take 50 years, and more likely, never happen at all. The forest grew in 10 years. The answer had been lying in plain sight the whole time. The farmers had not been wrong about the plant. They had been wrong about everything else. It was the livestock. Sheep and cows never touched the thorny gorse. They couldn't get through the thorns, but they ate every soft thing that came up underneath it, right down to the ground. The young seedlings were eaten off at exactly the speed they came up. The forest simply never got the time to grow, and the gorse seemed unbeatable. But once every last sheep was taken off those slopes, everything changed. The seedlings finally survived. They rose up, grew over the wall of thorns, and cut off its sun. The unbeatable weed turned out to be nothing more than a nurse that raised its own replacement and left. So all of Wilson's work came down to one thing: clearing away whatever got in the way. He got rid of the wild goats that were eating the young trees. He trapped the animals that raided the birds' nests. He made sure no fire ever reached the land. He planted nothing and grew nothing. He simply removed whatever was stopping the forest from growing. But twice, nature itself came close to undoing all of it. In 2011, a fire burned through a third of the reserve. 10 years later, heavy rains sent landslides down the slopes, washing away the paths and taking out the bridges. And both times, the land came back the same way. The first thing to appear on the bare ground was that same gorse. The weed went back to work. It covered the slopes, closed off the sun, and got the ground ready for the trees. And behind it, the forest rose again. There was, however, one strange thing that Wilson noticed. The forest did not come back the same everywhere. On the slopes where the ground was covered by a native shrub, what eventually rose was the very forest that had stood here before people came, a beech forest. But where the nurse plant was the foreign gorse, a different kind of forest grew, a broadleaf forest with different trees and different undergrowth. And both forests were real. Every tree in them is native, the very same kind that grew here 1,000 years ago. It is just that under the gorse, some species raced ahead, and under the native shrub, others did. But here is what matters most. The forest that grew up under that hated weed turned out to be the richer one. It has more kinds of trees, more ferns, more birds. The plant they had called a curse on this land for 90 years gave it back not just a forest, but a forest fuller and more alive than the one before. Scientists are still arguing about why this happens. Today, where that farm once stood, there is forest from the mountaintop all the way down to the sea. It is young, not yet 40 years old, but it is a real forest already. Trees taller than a man, a thick canopy, ferns in the undergrowth, and beneath them grow hundreds of native plant species. In the mornings, birds sing here that had not been heard in these parts for decades. The falcon came back on its own, without any help from people, and in the ground there are giant earthworms again, up to 20 inches long. They loosen the soil, pass it through themselves, and mix it with fallen leaves, turning dead earth into living earth. Under pasture, worms like that cannot survive. They need a real forest. Their return means the land has truly come back to life, all the way down into the soil. Even the water has changed. More than 50 waterfalls now run all year round, and the water in the streams is so clean that hikers drink it straight as they walk. When this was a farm, those same streams dried up every summer. Bare ground holds no water, but the forest floor soaks it up like a sponge and gives it back a little at a time all year long. And this forest has started to bring in money simply for growing. The trees clean the air by taking in carbon dioxide, and the reserve is paid by industrial companies for that work the forest does. All of it without a single planted tree. But there is an important catch to this story. It does not mean that gorse should be left alone everywhere. It worked in the reserve because patches of old forest had survived nearby. Birds carried the seeds in from them. The livestock was taken off the slopes, and fire was never allowed onto the land again. Where there is no forest anywhere near, not one tree may come up under the thorns for decades. And on good pasture, gorse is still a weed, and farmers still fight it, as they should. This is no miracle. It is a nurse plant, and it only works where a forest still has somewhere to come back from. The neighbors came to understand that too. The farmer Wilson had helped in the drought, heard a bird one day in his own valley, a bird his family had not seen in decades. The forest was spreading out from the reserve, valley by valley, and the birds were following it. Today, there is not a single farmer left who is against the reserve. Many of them now put up fences around their steep slopes, where grazing was never worth the trouble anyway, to keep the sheep out, and simply let the forest grow. It is not only the land that changed, the people around it changed too, and the proof is hanging on a wall. There are two photographs taken from exactly the same spot above the valley. In the first one, from 1988, there is a yellow slope covered in gorse running down to the sea. In the second one, taken 28 years later, there is solid dark forest and not a thorn bush anywhere in the frame. Between those two pictures, not one tree was planted here. Nobody sprayed anything, and nobody dug anything out. People simply took the livestock off the slope and stepped aside. Hugh Wilson is 81 years old today. He still lives in that small house of his, running on solar panels. The man who was proven right by 40 years of photographs does not even use a digital camera. He has no computer and no mobile phone, and he still writes and draws the reserve's newsletter by hand, then mails it out on paper to 2,000 people. And he has never planted a single tree. Once, a neighbor's letter called him a fool and a dreamer and promised he would ruin the whole district. 40 years have passed. The fool and the dreamer turned out to be right. And 90 years of war on a weed with fire, poison, and bulldozers turned out to be wrong. The forest knew what to do the whole time. It did not need to be planted or watered or saved. It needed to be left alone.